Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Happy Mother's Day to those observing it, and a wish for solace and comfort for those who find today difficult, whether because of estrangement or loss, or simply the distance that we may have right now between ourselves and those that we care for. As I got in contact with the mothers in my life today, it was a mix of Zoom calls and phone calls and dropping things off to the local folks while wearing a mask and talking briefly from a good 10 or 15 feet away. Extraordinary times and extraordinary measures. It's about our current moment that I mostly want to talk today, about pandemic Ramadan 2020 and what it shows us about where we are and what it teaches us about where we might go. Ramadan always comes as a disruption to our normal schedules anyway. The pandemic is perhaps the biggest disruption many of us have ever faced to our normal ways of doing things. But to have them coincide, to have Ramadan during this pandemic, is a major new experiment. And I've been thinking a lot about Muslim adaptations to this current crisis, in part because I was teaching my Islamic law class when it started to about 20 mostly non-Muslim students. We didn't go back to Boston University after the break. I ended up teaching the second half of the course in sort of emergency remote mode. And because of the timeliness of the topic, we spent both the class midterm and our closing unit thinking about the impact of this pandemic on Muslim legal thought and also on individual and community Muslim practice. So I'm going to focus my remarks this afternoon on a couple of interrelated points. I'm going to talk a little bit about the aims of Islamic law. I'm going to say something about the role of intra-Muslim debate. And I'm going to talk about the reality of divergent experiences of Muslim community life and Muslim ritual life. I'm also going to say something about models for access, thinking about what lessons we might take forward into whatever the new normal ends up being. Before I get to those specific points, I want to say something really briefly about one of the main challenges that we face when we talk about Sharia or when we talk about Islamic law, because we're talking about a legal system, but also about an ethical code and a mode of ethical reasoning, and also a set of regulations governing ritual. And all of these levels can get mixed up and also legitimately overlap when we think about how to do ritual during the middle of a pandemic. We're thinking about rules, and we're thinking about ritual, and we're thinking about the ethics of the situation. How do we manage risk? How do we think about potential harms to ourselves and to others? And we can get confused sometimes because we're dealing with the textual sources of the law, so Quran and Sunnah. We're dealing with the rules of the jurists, the madhabs or the legal schools. We're dealing with the pronouncements of contemporary scholars who come from a variety of kinds of training and have a variety of kinds of platforms and official or non-official appointments. We're dealing with decisions of local religious leaders and community organizations like ICB Wayland. And then, of course, we have the sometimes contradictory pronouncements of governments and various levels of governments, and governments that may, like those in Wayland in Massachusetts in the United States, not officially subscribe to a religious ideology, and those like in Pakistan or in Saudi Arabia that do and seek to promulgate their rules about this moment of crisis in ways that are religiously justified or justifiable. And of course, another level of complication, not only can these things sometimes differ and diverge from each other, sometimes even when people all agree what the ideal is or what the rule is, they may not always follow it perfectly or even follow it at all. So when we talk about a range of Muslim responses to this novel coronavirus, we have to be clear that we're talking about a huge range of things. So I try to clarify these things for my students over the course of the semester. But my key goal for the class is to get them to understand three things about Islamic law. One, it's a sophisticated system of thought and practice. That two, is internally diverse. And three, changes over time. And I feel like all of those things are actually really important to emphasize, especially for non-Muslim students, because there can be a tendency to think of Islam as somehow simple or even simplistic, to think of it as unified, right? There is just the one idea or the one answer, and also to think of it as timeless. That this is simply what Muslims do. All Muslims do it. They do it because their religion tells them to do it, and it's all just right there. And in fact, what we see actually, if we think about what's going on since this pandemic began, even before anyone termed it a pandemic, we see actually that none of those stereotypes of Islamic law is accurate. So we see the sophistication and the complexity and the systematic nature of the law and legal thought as we think about the way that numerous Muslim responses have been grounded in the so-called maqasid al-sharia, or the aims or the purposes of the law. So Sunni jurists define these as five: deen, religion or faith; life, intellect, lineage, and property. Now, the fact that religion typically comes first in these lists doesn't mean that practicing religious obligations takes precedence over maintaining life. In fact, it could be argued, and has been argued, that religion requires the sustaining of life. And so one is upholding religion precisely by preserving the lives of individual Muslims. There are, of course, principles in place for thinking about norms and exceptions. So there's a maxim, for instance, that says avoiding harm takes precedence over obtaining benefits. But we also see, just even at a very practical and pragmatic level, the suspension of normal rules in a situation of danger. So for instance, Imam Shafi'i, back in the 8th century, wrote in his major book, and I'm going to tell you the name because it's Mother's Day, it's Kitab al-Umm, or the mother book. In his Kitab al-Umm, he writes that obviously, even though eating pork is forbidden, if someone is in danger of starvation, obviously they can consume pork in order to sustain themselves. Now, when it comes to something like COVID-19, it's not merely a matter of danger to an individual or exemption of an individual from a particular obligation or risk. Things are much, much more complicated, because even if the risk to a particular individual might not be tremendous, from coming to Jummah, for instance, if someone is young and healthy and has no pre-existing conditions and isn't immunocompromised and so forth, The reality is that that person might become a vector of transmission and bring the disease to others. Now, the more we learn actually about this virus and about the impacts that it has even on otherwise young and healthy people and the lingering health effects, the less and less it seems like some people just really kind of aren't in danger from it. But the point holds that one of the things one has to account for here, unlike in a number of other circumstances, is the potential harm that one might bring to others by participating. And so here's part of what arises in this complex system for thinking about balancing the purposes or the principles behind the rules of the Sharia with the norms for ritual obligation themselves. And that's where it gets to the second thing that I wanted to talk about, which is intra-Muslim dispute. Now, Ramadan is a famous time for intra-Muslim dispute. We have what one person has called the moon wars, right? And there are long-standing and very vigorous debates about whether or not one can calculate Eid, the start of Ramadan at the end of Ramadan, by using astronomical calculations, or whether a trustworthy reporter must in fact cite the moon, and what does this mean? It's cloudy, and so on and so forth. This year, the big debates have for once not been over moon sighting. We find instead a whole range of things for Muslims to disagree about. Whether mosques should be closed, whether one can have social distancing during Jummah, is virtual Taraweeh permissible? We've seen Jummahs over Zoom. We've seen socially distant janazas. Actually, my son actually had to talk his grandparents out of going to a janaza today and staying by their car to pray because it simply is risky for them. They're over the age where they're deemed especially vulnerable. But the social pressure and the social desire and the religious imperative to be part of the commemoration of a Muslim life is incredibly powerful. We've seen the cancellation of Umrah, and we might see the cancellation of Hajj. We've also seen, I heard from my in-laws just today, but we've seen on social media grief and concern over the loss of communal spaces for worship. And that goes along with the shuttering of mosques for Jummah and the debates over the legitimacy of virtual Taraweeh prayers. Now, for instance, on the subject of virtual Taraweeh prayers, there are, as one might expect, competing legal opinions about the legitimacy of this. And one of the issues that arises is the question of, is a Taraweeh legitimate if you're not located in the same room as the Imam? And as my colleague Shaban Amir pointed out when people were promoting this line of argument, what does this mean about those masjids, not ICB Wayland, but quite a number, where women are not in the same room as the Imam leading the Taraweeh prayer, or for Jummah for that matter? What does it mean when the Fiqh Council of North America early on in saying that they weren't closing, this was before it was officially a pandemic, but that they weren't going to close mosques, nonetheless, they wanted women, children, and elderly men to stay home, but men in healthy men of the appropriate age could in fact come to the mosque, and were reminded that doing so was an obligation. these are reminders that when we think about legal reasoning and when we think about what are the pieces that go in to making an argument about how to proceed in a particular moment, different people take different things into account. And so what might it mean if we're now debating the legitimacy of virtual Jummah? Not that we don't want to go back to face, shoulder to shoulder in the musalla when it's possible. But the fact that we can't do it now, or shouldn't do it now, and mostly aren't doing it now, what does that mean in terms of opening up possibilities for later? Not just, in fact, for the question of women who might be watching Jummah on a closed circuit camera or an audio feed. But, what does that mean for people who have a disability that means they can't get to the mosque, or for people for whom there isn't a mosque within driving distance of their homes, or for people who have childcare or elder care responsibilities at home? All of these things end up being questions for communities to begin to think about. Which takes me to something else that I wanted to talk about today. Some communities have already been adapting for access. Some smaller inclusive mosque communities have been live streaming their services for people who don't have a welcoming mosque community within accessible distance, or people who can't, for whatever reason, physically attend the mosque because their mosque is inaccessible for some reason. These are already experiments in making communities virtual. They're not entirely unprecedented. Second Life, some of you are probably old enough to remember Second Life. You could do Hajj in Second Life, right? You could have mosques in Second Life. People built spaces that were places for the virtual experience, at least a gaming experience of worship. Now it's not a game, it's serious. Now, in asking about these questions about how do these experiments perhaps give us something to think about in terms of what things might look like moving forward out of lockdown, that raises a whole other set of questions, right? And one of them is this question of differential access applies to people in actual lockdown. It's actually one of my least favorite things to hear people talk about being in physical isolation at home as being like being in prison. It is difficult. It can be difficult, and it's more difficult for sure for some than for others. But Ramadan in particular is a time where incarcerated Muslims have a very, very difficult time. Not that incarceration isn't always difficult, but in particular, the rules about meals are especially difficult to follow. Now, in theory, prisoners are entitled to reasonable accommodations, to standard practices, and this means both halal meals and meals available on the schedule that they can eat while they are fasting for Ramadan. So incarcerated people have the right to observe Ramadan. But we saw in at least one Virginia prison this year that they simply didn't provide meals to large numbers of prisoners, making those prisoners either unable to fast or to effectively endanger their health entirely because they simply refuse to provide meals outside of the normal calendar or the normal timetable for those meals. Now, the other reason that thinking about incarcerated people during this Ramadan in particular is so important is because of the outsized impact of COVID-19 on incarcerated people. It's simply not possible to social distance in jail. Right? Jails and prisons often do not make hygiene supplies freely available to people whom they are incarcerating. In some places, people have to pay for soap. They may not have the option to wash their hands regularly. And they don't have access to testing or options necessarily for treatment, even though in theory they do. In practice, they tend not to. And apart from one Navy ship, where we have seen the big outbreaks for COVID-19 have been nursing homes, prisons and jails, and meatpacking plants. So in thinking about what we do, in thinking about Muslim responses to COVID-19, yes, it's important to think about what do we do in our homes. Yes, it's important to think about what don't we do in our mosques, which is Jummah and Taraweeh for the most part, as well as iftars. But it's also really important that we think about what do we do to provide resources and to provide safety and to promote justice for those who are most affected and most endangered by what's currently happening. I've spoken to you about Believers Bailout before. You know about that initiative. There have actually been a number of important decarceration strategies, movements, and campaigns, including in Massachusetts, Families for Justice and Healing, which has been focused on MCI Framingham, the women's prison, and advocating specifically for getting women held in pretrial facilities out, but also for women who are medically vulnerable, who are eligible for parole, and so forth, both as justice for the individuals themselves and also as a public health measure. Because the thing that I think we know as Muslims, and a thing that those of you who are doctors or health professionals know, and the thing that any of us who have loved ones in prisons or in nursing homes or in other places where people live and work very close together absolutely know, is that this is not a disease that we can tackle one person at a time. Right? This is something that, as miserable and as dangerous and as deadly as its effects have been, nonetheless proves how united we are, how much we have in common, and how bound up our lives and our well-being is with one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Kecia. If there are any questions, please feel free to chat them in, or if you want to unmute, you can put your hands up and I can unmute you. I just wanted to, first of all, say Happy Mother's Day to all the moms who have joined us. And Kecia, to you too.
Thank you.
And I know you've taken some time off your Mother's Day to join us and give us this some food for thought. So appreciate that immensely.
Thank you.
I did have one question actually, while we are waiting for others. Given that all these thoughts and debates are happening, um, how I'm just curious which direction, or is there a sense of a direction these debates are going in, or is there some thought or some body that's thinking about what the new future would look like that we can subscribe to or hear or listen to?
You know, it's a really interesting question. A colleague of mine once referred to Sunni Muslim religious thought as a Sunni free-for-all, right? Everybody just sort of wades in there, and you know, people offer all kinds of opinions, all kinds of legal reasoning. There are people who have years and years and years of training. There are people and credentials. There are people who have years and years and years of informal study and public health backgrounds. There are people like me who have academic training and some interest in looking at the products. And then there are individual lay Muslims who are sorting this out for themselves. What I will say is, it seems to me that most communities these days are closed, right? Most communities these days, most mosques in the US are not open for Jummah. They are not doing iftars. They are not doing Taraweeh. The thing is, a number of mosques also function effectively as social service centers. So there was actually a piece in the New Yorker not very long ago about Masjidullah in Philadelphia, where children actually often depend on the mosque for food. And the mosque has a number of other community support services that it runs. And it actually stayed open for a little while for Jummah, not for weeks, but was open early on with the dispensation that the governor had given, designating houses of worship as essential services, precisely in order to fulfill most of those community functions. And I think ultimately the imam, as he was quoted in the New Yorker, his reasoning was basically, yes, it's a religious obligation for men to come to Jummah, and yet because this is such a transmissible, contagious virus, because the risk to the community and to individuals is so high, we just can't be open for these services anymore. And I think that line of reasoning, the balancing of competing priorities, is absolutely right, which is Muslim communities, even where governments allow for the possibility of services, making those hard choices. There are some things, however, that communities haven't had choice about. So for instance, in New York City, which has actually a pretty significant proportion of Muslims in its population, we see that the traditional protocols for not just the janazah prayer, but for washing and shrouding before burial are actually not able to be followed in many cases, right? Because the overwhelming death toll in New York has meant that funeral services for anyone can't proceed as one might normally expect.
Thank you, Kecia. I'm just unmuting one more, Fariha Riaz. She would like to ask the question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome. So I have a question about actually mental health right now. I notice online a lot of different groups that I'm part of, where people are struggling with, they want to fast. Of course, it's an individual, decision.
Yeah.
But like I see that cycle, like it's the mental health toll of all of this. This happened to one of my brothers where even though my parents are older than 60, we had to force him to go live with my mom and have him stop fasting. It was just sort of like taking an impact, on, I felt like it was going to just make it worse. How are the communities dealing with that? Or is there literature surrounding that? I mean, exemptions, I was just curious if we could touch upon that, because that's a major issue right now, I think, that we're not addressing.
Yeah, I think we mostly aren't addressing it. And I've actually seen relatively little around fasting until the last couple of years, about, people for whom fasting might be sort of medically okay, right? So people who aren't, say, diabetic or hypoglycemic, right? Who in theory don't have a physical ailment that would prevent them permanently from fasting, but who may, for instance, suffer from disordered eating, right? And fasting could exacerbate anorexia, or other kinds of mental health issues where, fasting is just going to be sort of the one thing that puts them kind of over the edge in terms of their ability to cope. And I actually, there may very well have been traditionally trained Muslim scholars who have weighed in on this question. I know a number of Muslim women thinkers have done so. I'm not aware of anybody with formal traditional training who has, but last year and the year before, I actually really noticed that there was a lot more conversation online, specifically around eating disorders and the impact of eating disorders, the impact of fasting on eating disorders. In this case, I think one line of argument one might potentially venture, and I haven't seen anybody do this, and I of course am not a mufti, and so I'm not offering you a fatwa on this question, but I think there's a line of argument to be made about potentially mental health stress in this month being like other kinds of illnesses. So this is not like somebody anorexic for whom fasting is always going to be really potentially very, very dangerous. But this might be more like somebody who, let's say, has the flu, right? And can't fast when you have the flu, because if you do, you're going to impede your body's healing, right? Or make your illness worse. And so the argument could be an analogy to that, which is to say, if your mental health is fragile right now and fasting is going to make your mental health worse, mental health is health, right? And certainly, I think a lot of people are very much making those kinds of calculations very informally, based on the sense that they just can't do it right now. And that once things are normal, just like, with, or whatever the new normal is going to be, just like with, a physical illness, like the flu, you fast, you make up the days when you're better. This would be, you make up the days when the pandemic is over and you're able to maintain some kind of equilibrium.
Thank you, Kecia. And with that, I think we let everybody go. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are having another session again, Friday Khatara, Saturday 4:30 talk, and then Sunday 4:30 talk next week. So please watch out for the Zoom links or watch us on Facebook Live. The video for this talk would be available on our website as well. Oh, let me not forget, Wednesday at 9, I think. Wednesday at 9. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.